The morning Mama Efua's neighbors counted 5 black SUVs turning onto Atokpalm Lane at the same time. It was 9:04 a.m. on a Thursday, and not one of them had called ahead. She was in the back of the compound when they arrived, crouching over the coal pot the way she had crouched over it every morning for 31 years, fanning the coals with the flat of a torn cardboard box. Her wrapper was faded, the blue washed into something closer to gray. She had bought it in 2003 from the Mokola market stall near the station for 7 cedis, and she had worn it until the color decided to leave on its own. She did not hear the cars. She heard the coal pot, the chickens, and the particular silence of a compound that had not had children in it for 9 years. By the time she stood and pressed her palms to her lower back, all 5 of them were standing in the yard. She did not know who lived behind that door on Bourdion Road when she knocked on it 17 years earlier. But the man who had opened it that night, quiet, still, wearing a white kaftan with a single gold thread at the collar, had known exactly who she was. He had looked at her face for 7 full seconds before he said anything at all. What he said was not what she expected. And what she had done in the 17 years since was not what anyone who saw her that morning in 2008, crouching in the dirt with 5 children behind her, would have predicted either. Her full name was Efua Mensah Ajoa, and she was 74 years old. She weighed 51 kilograms, which was 6 kilograms less than she had weighed in 2003, the year the first child came. She had not lost the weight on purpose. She had simply been feeding others first and not keeping track of what was left. She was small in a way that made people underestimate the distance she had traveled. Her hands told a different story. Thick at the knuckles, dark at the creases, permanently stained at the left thumb from the indigo dye she had used to mark fabric in the workshop before the workshop closed. She kept her hair wrapped in a cloth the color of burnt umber. The cloth had been her daughter's. Her daughter had been gone for 23 years, and the cloth was the last thing she had that carried any smell of her. Though the smell had gone years ago, she still wrapped it the same way. She had lived alone on Atokpalm Lane in the Korleganto neighborhood of Accra since 1999, when her husband Kwame Ajoa passed from a kidney illness that the hospital on the main road could not treat because the dialysis machine had been broken for 11 days and they were waiting on a part from Kumasi that never came. She had sat with him in that room for 9 days. She had held his hand through the last night. She had walked home at 4:38 in the morning with 14 cedis in her bag and a bus that didn't come for 40 minutes. And when she sat down in the compound that morning, she did not go back inside for 4 hours. She did not cry in the way people expected her to cry. She did not drop things. She cooked. She cleaned. She folded the cloth that covered the doorway to his side of the compound, slowly, carefully, the way her grandmother had taught her to fold cloth, like it had a meaning, not just a shape. That was how she did things. Slowly, carefully, as though every action had a meaning she had not yet earned the right to ignore. The first child arrived in 2003. He was 4 years old, and his name was Emmanuel. He had been left at the gate of the compound by a woman Efua did not know, who knocked twice and was gone before Efua could get from the back of the house to the front. Emmanuel had been standing at the gate with a plastic bag containing 3 cassava balls wrapped in leaves, a torn pair of shorts, and a name written on a folded paper in someone's uncertain handwriting. That was all. Efua had taken the paper. She had taken the child. She had taken him inside and fed him 2 of the cassava balls and watched him eat with both hands. That night, she found an old sleeping mat and spread it in the corner of the room that had been Kwame's. She tucked the paper into the tin box she kept under the bed, the one that held her marriage certificate, the title to the house, and a photograph of her daughter at 6 years old, before the fever. She had not planned to raise children again. She had not planned most of the things that had shaped her life. By 2007, there were 5 of them. Emmanuel, who had arrived at 4 and was now 8, and had a memory for numbers that frightened his teachers, he could hear a price once and quote it back 3 weeks later without being asked. Abena, who had come at age 5 after her parents were killed in a Tro accident on the Tema motorway in 2004. Tobena, the boy from the market, who Ofua had found sleeping inside a trader's stall at Makola at the age of 6, eating raw groundnuts from a torn sack. Amma, a girl with a scar across her left palm that no one had ever explained, who arrived at age 7 in 2005 and spoke so quietly in her first year that some people thought she could not speak at all. And Kofi, who came last, at age 3, in a yellow wrapper, brought by a church deaconess who said only that the mother had not survived the delivery and there was no father she knew of. Efua raised all 5 of them on the earnings from a fabric stall she ran on Tuesdays and Fridays at the market 2 neighborhoods over, a small sewing business she operated from the compound on the other days, and a monthly contribution of 35 cedis from the local church women's cooperative that she never asked for and always repaid in other ways: alterations, school uniforms sewn at no charge, a meal left quietly at the door of a woman whose husband had stopped coming home. She never applied for any formal assistance. Not because she was proud in a foolish way, but because the offices required forms she couldn't afford to miss work to file, and the forms required documents she didn't have, and the process required patience she couldn't spare from the 5 children who needed it more urgently. She walked 3.2 kilometers to the market and 3.2 kilometers back, twice a week, with the fabric rolled in a bundle she carried on her head. She had done this for 11 years. Her shoes were replaced every 2 years, always the same style, flat rubber soles, brown, from the row of vendors near the Kwame Nkrumah Circle bus stop. She paid 18 cedis a pair. The children wore school uniforms she sewed herself from fabric she bought at cost from a wholesale trader who owed her a long favor. Emmanuel's first uniform had been cut from the wrong brown, a shade too dark, and she had cried about it alone in the compound after the children slept because she wanted him to look right on his first day. And she had miscalculated the dye. She had fixed it by the 2nd week, re-dyeing the whole thing on a Sunday morning in a bucket with the compound gate closed so none of them would see her working. None of them ever went to school in a uniform that wasn't pressed. The neighbors watched all of this and said many things. Most of what they said was not kind. A woman alone with 5 children she had not given birth to, children with different names, different origins, no fathers coming to the gate. There were stories, and none of the stories were generous. The woman on the right side of the compound, a heavy-set woman named Akosua, who sold frozen water sachets from a cooler outside her door, told anyone who asked that Efua was collecting children for some benefit she was not sharing. The man across the lane said the children would grow up to be trouble, because nobody who started in trouble finished anywhere else. Efua heard most of this. She said very little in return. What she did instead was teach each of them something particular. Emmanuel she taught to keep accounts, not formal accounting, but the kind that mattered in a household. How much was spent? How much remained? How long the remaining amount would last if nothing changed? And what would need to change if something did? Abena she taught to sew, first by hand and then on the old Singer machine with the broken tension knob that Efua had repaired with a strip of rubber from a bicycle tire. Tobena she took to the market with her on Fridays and taught him to read people the way a trader reads weather, who was shopping to spend and who was shopping to look, who needed something named before they knew they needed it, who would walk away and come back. Amma she taught to read every book she could get. And Efua got books from anywhere: churches, Neighbors, the second-hand stall near the lorry park that sold them for 1 cedi each. Kofi, who was the youngest and the quietest, and who had the most precise hands of any child she had ever seen, she taught to draw. She brought him pencils and the backs of receipt paper, and she put them in front of him and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say, the child's hands knew what to do before his mind caught up. This was in the years when the house had 4 light bulbs, 2 working, 1 burned out, 1 loose in the socket, and the roof of the back room had a section that let in water during heavy rain that she covered with a piece of zinc sheeting she had bought for 12 cedis and pressed flat against the rafters by herself on a Saturday afternoon in 2005. If this story is already sitting with you the way I think it is, subscribe now. Because what happened the night Efua knocked on the door on Bourdian Road is the part that changes every single thing that came before it. The night in question was a Wednesday in February 2008, and it was 8:57 p.m. Emmanuel was 13 and had spent that afternoon at the district education office trying to explain to a clerk named Beatrice, who wore her name tag on her left shoulder instead of her right, and who kept her eyes on her computer screen through the entire conversation, that the secondary school scholarship form his teacher had given him required a guardian's national ID and proof of residence, both of which Efua had, but that he could not leave school early to bring them, because the next assessment was the following morning, and missing it meant missing the form period entirely. Beatrice had told him, without looking up, that the deadline was Thursday at noon, and if the forms were not complete with the required documentation by Thursday at noon, then the application would be withdrawn and his name removed from consideration. She said this with the tone of someone reciting a bus schedule. Emmanuel had thanked her, which was not a thing she deserved, and he had walked home. Efua heard this at 6:30 in the evening. She looked at the form. She looked at the documents. She looked at the 14 cedis in the envelope on the shelf, the household money for the week, earmarked for Market Day Friday. She put the documents into the tin box, put the tin box under her arm, and at 8:12 p.m., she left the compound. She needed a copy of the documents. The nearest copy shop was on the main road and closed at 8 Dillo. The one 2 kilometers beyond it, near the night market, closed at 9 Dillo. She walked. By the time she arrived, it was 8:49 p.m. The attendant, a young man with tired eyes and a phone propped against the machine playing a football match, told her the machine was jammed, and he had sent for a part that morning that had not arrived. He looked at her the way people look at someone they will not be able to help and genuinely feel something about it. Not guilt, not indifference, but a kind of regret that is too small to change anything. She stood on that sidewalk for 4 minutes without moving. There was one other option. There was a business center on Bourdion Road. She had seen it twice through the window of the Trotro that she knew stayed open late, because she had once seen its lights on past 10:00 p.m. when she was coming back from an emergency alteration job. She did not know what it cost. She had 7 cedis left in her wrapper pocket after the walk. She did not know if that was enough. She walked to Bourdion Road. The business center was on the ground floor of a building with a blue gate that was partially open. She stepped through. The center was shut, the metal shutter pulled down, padlocked. But the light in the building above it was on, and there was a door at the side with a buzzer. She pressed the buzzer. She stood on that step for what felt like a long time. When the door opened, it was not an attendant who opened it. The man who stood in the doorway was perhaps 60 years old. He was wearing a white kaftan with a single gold thread at the collar. He was not tall, but he stood the way some people stand, as though the space around them had rearranged itself in advance. His name, she would learn later, was Chief Niakwe Owusu Boateng, and he was the kind of man whose name appeared on buildings in Accra in a particular quiet way. Not in lights, not on signs, but engraved into stone at the corner of a doorframe, in a font that did not need to be large because it was not trying to convince anyone of anything. He looked at her face for 7 full seconds. Not at the wrapper, not at the tin box under her arm. At her face. Then he said, "You are Kwame Ajoa's wife." She had not told him her name. She had not told him anything. She was standing on his doorstep at 9:04 p.m. on a Wednesday with a tin box and 7 cedis and a secondary school scholarship form with a Thursday noon deadline. She said, "Yes." He opened the door wider and said, "Come in." Kwame Ajoa had worked for Chief Owusu Boateng's construction company for 6 years before his illness. He had been a site supervisor, meticulous, reliable, the kind of man who stayed late, not because he was asked to, but because he had decided a thing should be done correctly, and correctly sometimes required extra time. Chief Owusu Boateng had attended Kwame's funeral. Efwa had not noticed him there. She had been looking at the ground. He had known her name. He had known the address on Attic Palm Lane. He had known, through some network of people who knew things about people, that she had been raising children alone since Kwame passed. He had not come. He was not a man who arrived uninvited. But he was also not a man who forgot. He made the copies. He made 4 of them, on a machine in the back of the house that hummed with a particular mechanical satisfaction. He handed them to her in a brown envelope. Then he sat across from her at a table made of dark wood and asked her to tell him about the children. She told him. Not everything. She was not a woman who told everything to someone she had just met. But she told him about Emmanuel's numbers, Abina's hands on the sewing machine, Tobena's instinct at the market, Ama's reading, Kofi and his pencils. She told him about the scholarship form. She told him about Thursday at noon. He listened the way some people listen, without preparing a response, without looking for the moment when it would be appropriate to interrupt. When she finished, he said, "The scholarship is for one school. I know the director of another school, a better one. If Emmanuel's mathematics is what you describe, I would like to test it myself. Not tonight. Saturday morning." She looked at him. He said, "If I am wrong about what you have described, I will say so. If I am right, the boy will not need the scholarship form." She went home. She delivered the copies to the education office at 10:14 a.m. on Thursday. Beatrice received them without looking up. On Saturday morning, Emmanuel sat at the dark wood table on Bourdian Road, and Chief Owusu Boateng placed in front of him a sheet of figures, not school mathematics, not examination problems, but actual financial projections from one of his companies, with 3 errors buried in the columns. Emmanuel found all 3 in 11 minutes. He found a 4th one that Chief Owusu Boateng had not put there deliberately, and that turned out to be real. What followed happened slowly, the way real things happen. Emmanuel was enrolled at the school on a full bursary that was not called a scholarship. Chief Owusu Boateng did not like the word, said it made children feel watched rather than trusted. Over the next 3 years, each of the other children was quietly assessed, not as charity cases, but as individuals with specific capacities that warranted specific investment. Abina was enrolled in a design and textile program. Tobena was placed in a business and trade apprenticeship with a company that Chief Owusu Boateng held a minority stake in. Ama received a library membership, and then, 2 years after that, a scholarship to a university in Kumasi. Kofi, whose drawings had by then expanded from the backs of receipt paper to careful architectural sketches of the neighborhood he had grown up in. was supported through a 5-year architecture program in Accra. None of them were told they were charity. They were told they were talented, which they were. Efua continued to live on Attic Palm Lane. She continued to run the fabric stall on Tuesdays and Fridays. She sewed school uniforms for the neighborhood children through 2014, when her eyes began to make close work harder. She did not move to a bigger house when the children began to work and send money back, though they asked her every year. She accepted the money with the same precision she had applied to everything. She kept records of what she received and from whom and when, in a blue notebook with a green cover that she had bought from the stationery stall near the Kwame Nkrumah Circle bus stop in 2011. Chief Owusu Boateng married a second wife in 2013. She was nothing like his first wife, who had died in 2001. She did not like the arrangement with Efua's children, which she considered a financial decision that had not been cleared with her. She said so once, in a way that was intended to reach Efua. What came back to her was silence, which was more unsettling than any response would have been. By 2019, Emmanuel was 30 years old and managing the accounts division of a regional logistics company headquartered in Tema. Abina had her own textile design studio on Osu Oxford Street with 4 employees. Tobena had co-founded a trading firm that exported shea butter and local grain to 3 European markets. Ama was a secondary school headmistress in Kumasi, the youngest to hold the position at that school in 30 years. Kofi's architectural firm had completed 2 public buildings in Accra and 1 in Abuja. None of this was visible from Attock Palm Lane on a Thursday morning in 2024. What was visible was Mama Efua crouching over her coal pot, fanning it with a torn piece of cardboard, and 5 black SUVs turning onto the lane at 9:04 a.m. They had not coordinated it. That was the part the neighbors would talk about for months afterward. Each of them had decided, independently, on the same morning to arrive. Emmanuel had been in Tema and had driven 2 hours. Abena had canceled a client meeting. Tobena had moved a call he had spent 3 weeks arranging. Ama had taken the overnight bus from Kumasi and had not slept. Kofi had come from Abuyo on the first flight he could book and had driven from Kotoka Airport in a rental car that smelled of citrus air freshener and plastic. They came into the compound one at a time and stood in the yard. Efua straightened up from the coal pot and pressed her palms to her lower back. She looked at them, all 5 of them, standing in her compound in good clothes, serious faces, the kind of faces that meant something had been decided. She said, "You didn't call." Emmanuel said, "We did not want you to prepare anything." She looked at him, then at the others. The coal in the pot was beginning to catch properly, sending a thin white line of smoke up toward the morning. She said, "Sit down then. There is tea." They sat on the low wooden chairs in the compound, the same chairs they had sat on as children, repainted twice since then, but still the same underlying wood. Efua went inside and came back with 6 cups on a tray. The tray was metal, with a pattern of blue flowers around the edge. They had all eaten from that tray. Some of them had dropped things from that tray. The dent on the right side near the handle was from an afternoon in 2009 that Kofi and Tobena would not look at each other about, even now. They told her what they had come to say, together, without rehearsing it, because they had all arrived at the same sentence through different roads. They wanted to move her somewhere better, somewhere larger, somewhere with help, with company, with floors that did not need to be swept by a woman of 74 who had been sweeping them alone for 23 years. She listened. She drank her tea. She held the cup in both hands the way she had always held it, close to her chest, like the warmth was something to hold on to. Then she said, "The house has a title. My name is on it. Kwame's name is on it. I am not leaving a house with Kwame's name on it. There was a silence. Then Abina said, "We are not asking you to leave the house. We are asking you to let us come back to it." Efua looked at her. Abina said, "We want to fix the roof, the back room, the zinc." Emmanuel said, "And the fence on the east side." Tobena said, "And the gate is wrong." Efua set down her cup on the tray. She looked at the five of them, at the faces she had watched change from children's faces into these adult faces, these competent, dignified, serious faces. And she felt something she had no language for and no desire to name. It was in her chest somewhere. It was not sadness, and it was not exactly joy, and it was not relief, though it contained all three. It was the thing that comes when you have carried something for a long time and you are not asked to put it down. You are asked, instead, if you would be willing to let others carry it alongside you. She said, "The zinc was doing fine." And Emmanuel said, "Mama." And she said, "Start with the gate." She was still sitting in that chair at noon, talking, when the neighbor Akasua came to her own gate and watched the 5 cars in the lane and watched the woman in the faded blue wrapper who had raised 5 children on 18 seti shoes and market day fabric. This woman who had been the subject of so many stories told without her permission, now sitting in her compound with her children around her, in the ordinary, permanent way of a thing that had always been true. Dexter thought he had the last word on who she was. He did not. Some things cannot be taken, not by bureaucratic forms with Thursday deadlines, not by copy machines with broken parts, not by neighbors who construct stories out of what they cannot understand, not by circumstances that keep a person small when they are too busy to explain how large they really are. Efua Mensah Adjoa had raised 5 human beings who knew how to work, who knew how to build, who knew how to sit in a compound on wooden chairs and drink tea from a metal tray with a dent near the handle and still know exactly where they were. That is what she had given them. Not money, not connections, not even opportunity, though the opportunity came. She had given them the architecture of themselves, the part that does not collapse when the external structure fails, the part that knows its own name even when no one is saying it. You cannot teach that from a textbook. You can only live it in front of people until they absorb it through the living. And what those 5 cars on Attic Palm Lane meant, what they really meant, under the good clothes and the rental car and the canceled meeting, was that they had absorbed it. Every morning she woke before them to start the coal pot. Every uniform pressed before the week began. Every book brought home for 1 seti from the second-hand stall. Every time she folded the cloth carefully, slowly, as though the cloth were precious and the act of folding it were a kind of instruction. They had been watching. They had learned. If you have someone in your life who gave you more than they kept for themselves, whose hands carry the marks of that giving, this is the moment to tell them that you saw it. Not someday, now. Leave a word in the comments about someone who raised you the way Mama Efua raised hers. Not perfectly, not with resources, but with everything she had. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.